Greetings. Welcome back to the Black Pill. We're talking about offensiveness. Is pornography good for society? This is the question. Is pornography good for the society? It's a building block in a big argument. Let's go. 1950s. We have two big sets of studies on pornography, 1950s, 1980s. They're both really driven by the government's desire to put limits on what citizens can see. Acting ostensibly toward the public good, but, in the 80s it was the Reagan administration, and in the 50s it was McCarthyists, anti-communist virulence chasing this, and so really it's about authoritarian power. So in the 1950s, we studied the effects of pornography on individuals, and when you give people surveys about their attitudes towards women and then expose them to violent pornography, they increasingly endorse violence towards women and sexual violence towards women. Various forms of degradation and, to a lesser degree, violence in wider society. Okay, pornography is not good for an individual. Pornography is probably not good for the person watching the pornography. All right, established. And from there, we get a bunch of censorship. We get a bunch of interstate commerce laws. You can't put smut in the mail, whatever. Yeah, the industry starts winning lawsuits, though, about freedom of speech. And so we do another set of studies looking around in the 1980s. And what's happened really between World War II and the Reagan administration is a liberalization of national governments around the world. Japan lost World War II. Their authoritarian regime collapsed, and they had to do something else, and they became largely a liberal democracy. A few other nations, same thing happens. And so people have access to pornography in the 1980s who did not have access to pornography in the 1950s. And what you'd want to do as a scientist is, if you have this hypothesis that that pornography is bad for people and pornography drives people to increasingly violent fantasy, does that play out in public? And so you'd exactly want countries where pornography had been legalized, and you'd want to compare rates of violence, and particularly sexual violence against women, between no pornography and pornography. All right, so go track that down. And what you find out is that the opposite happened. Right? Social scientists expected to find an uptick in violent crime and sexual violence against women in places where pornography had been legalized, and found the opposite. A downtick, a substantial downtick in violent crime and sexual crimes against women. So the government really wanted to use science to justify censorship. In the first case, they succeeded in doing that. In the second case, they failed in doing that. So what are we saying? Are we saying pornography reduces violence? No, we're not saying that at all. Science rule 1. The first rule of science is never infer causation from correlation. Very important. Causation and correlation are separate. Just because X varies with Y does not mean X is causing Y. There are alternate possible explanations. For example, there could be no relationship between the two variables at all. If you go on Tyler Vigen's website, you'll find out that the number of films in which Nicolas Cage acts in a given year correlates really nicely with the number of people who fall into a backyard swimming pool and drown. Does that mean that Nicolas Cage should stop making movies? No, those things are completely unrelated. Nicolas Cage should stop making movies for other reasons, okay? For completely unrelated reasons. Those things are not related at all. He's not to blame. So it could be that they're totally unrelated or spurious. It could be that X causes Y. It could also be that Y causes X. And it could be that there are one or more additional variables we've not accounted for. There could be a Z causing both X and Y. Is pornography good for society? What happened between World War II and the Reagan administration was a rise in liberal democracies, meaning more freedom, more prosperity, more democracy, more education, more choice, less censorship. And so people in formerly moralistic authoritarian societies suddenly had access to art, literature, science, religion, and smut. The smut didn't reduce their violent impulses, nor did it dissipate those impulses. Fantasy violence demonstrably does not lead to catharsis. The Bobo doll experiments, look those up one day. Bobo doll, B-O-B-O. But a civil society led to a decline in violence. Educated, free, prosperous people don't need violence. A society that values women affects men's behavior much more than pornographic violence does. Porn's not good for society. Access to pornography is good for society. More liberalism is good for society. Authoritarianism through fear, inequality, violent modeling, repression of emotions, in-group and out-group generation, suppression of free speech, and ignorance increases the things they claim to be able to decrease. Cracking down on drugs tends to increase drug use. Cracking down on underage sex tends to increase teen pregnancy, STIs, and abortions. Is pornography offensive? It depends who you ask. It's hard to exactly draw a line between pornography and other forms of free expression. But we tend to know when we've crossed that line. We tend to know that. Because it's offensive to some people, even if it were offensive to most people, ought we to ban it? In America, for now, a liberal democracy, we take the tack of providing good information about other things, and then trusting people to make their own decisions. What things do we not take that tack over? Who's resistant to providing information and trusting decisions? Who's offended?